Today's motion is Asia's rise will lead to a new world order. While you vote, let me outline what we are debating today. The world is undeniably going through a time of major change, and the rise and development of Asian countries, especially China, are a key factor. This century has been hailed as the Asian century, and there is a widespread sense that the unipolar moment we experienced after the fall of the Soviet Union is ending. Asian countries are clearly more engaged on the global stage. Think of China's ambitious Belt and Road Initiative aiming to reshape global infrastructure, or the recently expanded BRICS group, which wants to be a platform for the global south and which includes both India and China. But we're also seeing intensifying strategic competition between the US and China, war in Ukraine and the Middle East, as well as expanding conflicts around Taiwan, technology, and how to address global issues like climate change. The current international system, I think we can all agree, seems ill-equipped to deal with any of these. So will the system inevitably have to change? Will we see a more complex, multipolar order, or even a new Cold War? Is the era of Western dominance coming to an end? Or will the deep global interlinkages in trade and technology prevent any fundamental change and keep the current system intact, perhaps with some adjustments? In short, will Asia's rise lead to a new world order? Thank you for your votes. I will close the poll now, and I hope you have all had a chance to vote. Now, it's finally time to introduce our teams. As is customary, I will keep these introductions very, very short. You have their bios on our website, so that leaves more time for the debate. Arguing in favor of tonight's motion, here to my right, are Abigaël Vasselier, who is the Director for Policy and European Affairs at MERICS, the Mercator Institute of Chinese Studies based in Berlin. She was previously working for the European External Action Service, kind of the foreign ministry of the EU, and the European Council on Foreign Relations. Joining her to argue in favor of the motion that Asia's rise will lead to a new world order is John Delury. He's a professor for modern Chinese history at Yonsei University in Seoul, currently a fellow at the American Academy in Rome. He's also a senior fellow at the Pacific Century Institute and a senior fellow at the Asia Society. You're a fellow in many places. On the other side, arguing against the motion that Asia's rise will lead to a new world order, Julia Ganter, who is the Program Director for International Affairs at the Berlin-based Körber Foundation, where she also heads the Emerging Middle Powers Initiative, about which we hopefully can hear some more later. And joining her is John Lee, Director at the consultancy East-West Futures, researcher at the Leiden Asia Center, previously also working for the aforementioned MERICS, as well as the Australian government. Thank you all very much for being here tonight. Without further ado, I will ask the team arguing in favor of the motion and Abigaël Vasselier to deliver her opening remarks, which will be timed at exactly 5 minutes. Abigaël, you have the floor.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I think no one would have doubts that the new world will be driven by Asia and centered around China. Think about the clothes you're wearing. They're coming from India, from Bangladesh, maybe from Pakistan. But let's face it, this is the old world. Think about the car you're going to be driving in like 5 years. Is it going to be a rolling iPad that is made in China? Because I think so. China has technology we don't have. China has potential we no longer have, and this is the word of tomorrow. Since the 1980s, the world has been talking about the Asian century as a potential, but this is no longer a potential. I think we can acknowledge that the Asian continent has emerged from 30 years of political changes, from an incredible economic growth. And let's be honest, for every one of you having a company today, is there a second market like China or like India with Indian potential? No, there is certainly not. And actually, in 2021, Brookings Institute predicted that the top 4 consumer markets in 2030 would be China, India, Indonesia, and the US. So you have a case for Asia being the next consumer market that we are not going to be able to replace. So in reality, I will argue that Asia's rise is on a speed and on a trajectory that no one of you had anticipated, and even us as Asia experts, and China is going to be the engine of it. The demographics are very clear. With an incredible integration in global supply chains, the large demographic wave that we are seeing coming from the Asian continent is simply going to translate into a big consumer market, which we're all going to benefit. And today, there is a reason why Europe exchange on a daily basis 2.3 billion euros per day with China. So we can have doubts, and we can de-risk, and we can put economic security as a motor of our economic trajectory, but at the end of the day, the Asia's rise will lead to the New World Order, and there is no doubt about that. So Asia could account for over half of global output by the middle of the century, and I think I've made my case for the global integration. Then which country can today claim that it has lifted 800 million out of poverty in less than one generation? This is China. So we may disagree with the Chinese model, but today, when African countries or Latin American countries are looking at China's development, this is what they're seeing. And this is a big appealing model for these countries. Asia will become, if not already, a technological hub. In 2023, the International Federation of Robotics declared that 33 of all newly deployed industrial robots were actually installed in Asia. So Asia has the capacity and has the demand for becoming a technological leader. And this comes with a price, and the price is the definition of a new geopolitical balance. And our future is intertwined. Every time China's economy is slowing down, our economy can feel it. Every time the financial market is shaking in Asia, we can feel it. This is our new reality. And if tomorrow there was to be a crisis in the Taiwan Straits, it would cost us $2 trillion in a blockade scenario. This gives you a sense that Asia is the place of crisis and also opportunity. So yes, China is going to be the engine that is going to reshape the new world. With that comes the question of US-China tensions. With that comes the question of what are our partners in the Global South going to think, whether the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative is an attractive model for redefining the rules-based international order or not. But I think no one would have doubts that what we are looking at today is a new world order that is going to be reshaped by Asia. Finally, the question for us today is whether we want to acknowledge the trend of Asia's rise, recognize it and adapt to it, and make sure that we have a space in which we live in this new world or we live in denial.
Thank you very much, Abigaël Vasselier. 5 minutes, almost exactly to the clock. Nicely done. I'm moving it right along to the team arguing against the motion. Julia Ganter, you also have 5 minutes on the clock. The floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I want to be provocative and actually claim in the next couple of minutes that today's motion that we are arguing is not based on one, but two false assumptions. First, that it's only Asia's rise that we need to look at to understand how the world order is going to develop. And second, that we will see a new world order emerge. Now, on the first false assumption, there is no way to neglect that Asia is on the rise, and we have just heard that. However, I want to give you 3 examples why we really should also consider other countries, I call them emerging middle powers outside of Asia, to understand the changes that will go on in our world order. First, considering economic indicators. In 2024, 11 of the 20 fastest growing economies will be based on the African continent. Second, demographic factors. While China, South Korea, and also Japan, they're really challenged by an aging population and all the economic problems that this brings with, we see that on the African continent, 60% of the population is under the age of 25. This brings an enormous demographic dividend and a lot of opportunities and chances, as we can currently see when we look at the African startup sector that is driven by young Africans, and they have managed to raise funds of 3.3 billion in 2023, and I think that's a good example. The third example that I want to give you are global challenges. And the biggest challenge that we all face is climate change. We have to tackle that challenge. There's no way around it. And this will lead to new leadership. The Amazon rainforest is a place that is really crucial for tackling the climate change. And 60% of the Amazon rainforest are based on the Brazilian territory. We have already heard from the Brazilian leadership that they want to assume such a leadership role globally, and they will host the next climate conference COP30 in 2025 in Belém. And they also put in their G20 presidency sustainability as a centerpiece of their agenda. So to sum it up, there's much happening outside of Asia, and with these countries rising, we will also see new leaders emerge. Now, about those countries and about the second false assumption that I want to tackle, that we will see a new order emerge. Asia, and I think Asia itself doesn't want a new order emerge, but even if it were so, it would need others to help it to make this massive change going on. And the countries I just talked about, these emerging middle powers, they really have no interest in such a big change. They're status quo powers. We have recently done a survey at Körber Stiftung that indicates that policymakers in emerging middle powers, 61% of them, they prefer a reform of the United Nations Security Council, not a replacement. And they also have 40% of them really high hopes that the G20 as an institution will tackle the challenges in the future. These are two institutions and groupings that are part of our existing order. So there's really no interest in replacing the key elements of our current order, the UN system, the international globalized trade, or also common binding bodies for international law. There's also important documents that underline that there is really an interest in reform and improvement of the international order in these countries. An example is the Eswatini Consensus, a proposal of the African Union on how the United Nations could be reformed. Another example is the last G20 Leaders Declaration from India that indicates that the World Trade Organization is really crucial for our multilateral trade agreement, despite all the problems it has. So I think these examples show that these are all no calls for revolution. They're calls for reform, calls for improvement. And in these countries and in those regions, there's even positive examples that even if it takes time, improvement can happen in those reforms. One example is the fact that the African Union joined the G20 just last year. Another example is the African Union itself that emerged from a reform process within Africa, of the Organization of African Countries. And with that, I hand it back to Nico. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Julia, for the opening remarks arguing against the motion. It's now time for rebuttals, where each team has the chance to add more arguments for their side, but also to rebut some of the arguments that we've already heard. The first rebuttal goes to the team arguing in favor of the motion. John Delury, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Nico, and welcome everyone. So it was an interesting move by Julia. The way I would interpret what you've heard so far is Abigail did such a perfect job proving the motion that Julia redefined the terms of the motion and made a very impressive speech in terms of Africa's rise and Latin America's rise, leading to a new world order, and convincing, but our proposition is Asia's rise. And so the arguments already made by Abigail, establishing the rise of Asia and the transformation of the old world order, I think still stand, even if we agree with most or all of the points that Julia made. And the second key point in the other side's opening statement in terms of countries around the world, again, not particularly focused on Asia, but globally, that there's not really an alternative vision to the existing international institutions. We're not we're not debating that. We don't really have to debate that. The question of whether there's revolution or reform, again, is sort of to the side of the key question, which is the status quo world order sort of unraveling before our eyes, and is a new world order emerging out of that, and is Asia central to that transformation? So with that rebuttal, let me also try to reinforce a little bit our attempt, and in a way mirror some of the moves that the other side has made in terms of really getting us to think more about the proposition, because the proposition contains kind of these three premises: that Asia is rising, which we've I think Abigail's convincingly established, that some kind of new world order will emerge. It's a future tense. It's not has emerged. It's that it will emerge, and that Asia's rise is in the middle of that, in some way leading it. I want to maybe even question the premise that Nico gave us in terms of what do we mean when we talk about these world orders? What's the status quo world order, and what might the future, this new world order, look like? And in particular here, forgive me, since I'm trained as a historian, I have to try my best to bring some dates into the discussion and some historical background into the debate. And I would argue against some of the framing, and against certainly a lot of the language that policy makers and diplomats would use, for example, in Washington, that the world order is not, you'll often hear the term, again, in the US discourse, the international rules-based order, which has apparently existed since 1945. As a historian, that's hard for me to accept. It's hard for me to buy. There was maybe a brief moment from 1944 to 1947 where there was such a thing as an international rules-based order. And that did lay certain foundations that still exist. Some of those the other side mentioned in their opening in terms of basic international institutions, most obviously the United Nations. But already by 1947, and certainly when you get to 1950, the Korean War, I come to you from the Korean Peninsula, where you can't forget about the importance of the Korean War. But throughout the entire Cold War period, really the world order was not premised on international cooperation and internationalism. It was premised on superpower rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. So there are almost kind of two orders already: a very brief internationalist order, and then a long period of bipolarity in the Cold War, which ends obviously with the fall of the Soviet Union, ushering in this moment of American unipolarity. I think this question of, and I think we may try to come back to this throughout the discussion, the question of U.S. hegemony and U.S. power is really what we're talking about when we say the status quo world order. That unipolar dominance and hegemony that the United States enjoyed in the wake of its victory over the Soviet Union in the Cold War, that's really what we saw the United States sustain through certainly the heights in the 1990s, but also then the depths of the global war on terror. And it's kind of then through the economic crisis of 2008 and the global financial crisis. And at this point, we're living, I think, in historical terms, in this transitional moment where it's kind of this old man who ran his race and is just staggering to the finish line, but the capacity is dwindling. Meanwhile, again, as Abigail already established, it's not only China, but driven by the centrality of the rise of China, Asia is creating some future new world order, none of which we know will, the exact description of. Okay, I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you. Nicely wrapped up, just in time. Thank you for the rebuttal from the team arguing in favor of the motion, and that of course brings us to the rebuttal from the team arguing against, John Lee, who has been taking copious notes, I see, so we're looking forward to having those condensed in 5 minutes.
All right, thanks, Nico. And I have to thank John for finishing on that note of confusion as to the other side's argument as to whether this is about the rise of China or about the rise of Asia. Because I would accept the proposition that China is indeed an engine, but that's only half the picture, because it's an engine that works as part of an interdependent system. And China rose and is still rising as part of this system, which includes not just the other Asian countries, but also what we call traditionally the first world, the US-aligned rich economies of which the country we are sitting in is a part. In fact, independence still rules, and that goes from both ends of this order, not just from the developing countries side, but also from that of the wealthy countries, which for their part still hold the commanding heights in technology that the Asian world, China included, still relies on to drive that economic growth, which is said to be creating this new world order. For that matter, China itself, everyone knows now, is facing dire straits as a result of being potentially cut off from these core technologies, chips, etc., by action from Washington and its advanced allies. And indeed, all of the argument over capacity you read about shows how the rich country markets are still important, not just to China, but to developing countries. Because, of course, even if we talk about the developing world as a whole, we are talking not about replacement, but about reform of a common international order. And despite what the other side has tried to argue, this is exactly the difference that matters. We are not talking about a new order, but a rebalanced one in which developing countries are still wanting to hold to fundamental concepts like Westphalian sovereignty, a global collective system in the UN. What they want, and this goes for China as much as any of the others, is simply a re-shifting of power that allows them to pursue their interests and is more equitable from their viewpoint, whether it's in terms of the application of international law between Ukraine and Gaza, or when it comes to the rebalancing of the global trade system. No one is arguing for a return to pre-Westphalian concepts of organization, whether we're talking about the Roman Empire or about a Sinocentric tributary system. Finally, I think we need to look again, when we talk about the rise of a new order, at what forces might push back against it. And I think it's important to understand that one reason you will not see a decisive different order is that the rich countries which control the key technologies still in many respects are not incentivized to align against China, as we have seen from the practice, or rather the lack of it, of decoupling or de-risking. The reality is that, and we must talk about what's possible in reality, not in theory, the political costs of building an alternative bloc that would be the mirror to this so-called new order that is supposedly arising around China. The costs are so high as to be unsustainable in political terms in Europe, the United States, the other advanced economies. I mean, think about it. Would you go out and convince those farmers striking in Berlin or in Amsterdam that they should subsidize hundreds of billions of euros to reshore supply chains that can be more cheaply located in Asia over the next few decades? What we are seeing instead is a push from all sides to redefine the existing system on terms that will be more advantageous, whether it's in terms of the de-risking and reshoring on the advanced economies, or of a greater slice of the pie on the part of the developing world. Yet all of that is fundamentally taking place within the rules of the road, which go back not just to 1945, but indeed to the rise of the Western countries and the way that they completely redefined the international order. As I said, Westphalian sovereignty and a collective system of international law that no country, whether it's China or the United States, is seeking to replace with something else. And again, this is what we see reflected in the actual practice of our world today.
Thank you very much, and again, also job incredibly well done in sticking to your time. Those were the opening remarks and rebuttals from both teams. We're now moving into discussion and Q&A, where again, we welcome your questions. Thank you to all of you who've already submitted questions. There's plenty. If you do want to submit a question, you can scan this QR code. You can also see questions already submitted, and you can upvote them, and that will tell me that that's a question that many people want to have answered. And on that note, I usually start these Q&As by asking questions of my own, but there's one that came in that I really like and that I think is a really good starting point. So I'm turning to the team arguing in favor of the motion. Abigail, your argument really centered around the economic development and increasing economic attractiveness of Asian countries, again, especially China, but not just. And the question here is that attractive economies do attract immigrants from abroad. And if, you know, the Chinese economy, the Asian economies are so attractive as you claim they are, why are we not seeing stronger immigration to those countries, but still seeing immigration flows towards the US and towards Europe?
I think what I made a case for is the fact that the size of the consumer market in China and in the years to come, that's one point, plus the integration of the global supply chains are extremely appealing, and these are going to redefine the world order as we know it. And if you look at behaviors of companies, who is the international staff that has in its goodwill and its good mind the interest to relocate in China today, with all the questions it would raise on your data, on your quality of life, on the question of having party cells integrated to your companies. So I think we need to think about the question of the Chinese economy, not in terms of how much it's going to be appealing to international workers to migrate there, but think about your company's behavior. Are they leaving China? No, I don't think so. I think they are rather rethinking their supply chains, but they are staying in China because there is no second China, and today the Chinese market is the biggest, and they are ready to take the cost of some difficulties for staying there. And I think what we are also trying to point at is the fact that, yes, it's going to be China-centered, but look at Japan, look at South Korea, look at Indonesia, and if you take Asia as a whole, and China is not the whole of Asia, then you have a driving power that is attracting talents. In Japan, you have migrants and you have talents going. You have a compelling case for your companies to relocate either for the market or for the technologies. And today you have also companies going to Taiwan, because when it comes to semiconductors, this is the appealing place. You also have to think about India in terms of the size of the market, or Indonesia for the potential it represents. So China is going to be the center, but we are talking Asia here.
Thank you very much. Julia, you made, I think John has already said this, a very convincing case about a lot of these emerging middle powers, many of whom, of course, are Asian, actually being status quo powers. None of them want to change the global system. Yet, and again, John, thank you for bringing in the historical argument here. I would argue that that may not necessarily be the question here, right? So history is full of unintended consequences, and we could probably argue that the US and the Soviet Union didn't aim to have a bipolar Cold War system. It's just the inevitable result of historical actions. So even if none of these countries actively are aiming towards reshaping the new world order, isn't it kind of inevitable that just through their economic and political rise, this will be what happens, whether they want to or not?
So, excuse me. I think it's not only about aiming something and then something else happens. I think it's also about something else happens and you try to oppose it. Because I think an argument that we didn't, none of us brought up, is that there is something else, not only order, there can also be chaos. And that's definitely a factor that comes into play when you think about the future. And these countries, they definitely want to avoid chaos. So I think what we currently see in all the actions is that they strongly try to improve what we have because of that reason, because chaos could be a factor into play if we, despite whatever we aim. And all the actions that we're currently seeing is trying to improve something to prevent that this incident happens.
So what you're saying, if I understand you correctly, is that it's not so much that these countries maybe wouldn't accept the New World Order if it just kind of happened to come around, but that's unlikely, and if the alternative is chaos, they will stick to the status quo.
I wouldn't say they stick to the status quo. I think it's not only a black and white story here. There is gray zones, and a gray zone is improvement. So they would still try, of course. Talking to leaders in the African Union or talking to the president of Brazil, they wouldn't say, we just give up this idea to have a permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council or to be better represented in other institutions. So they wouldn't never give up this idea, but there is something in between status quo and chaos.
John, I want to ask you something which I think has been somewhat implicit in the argumentation from the team arguing against the motion, but I don't think it's been sort of put to the front very explicitly, so I have to ask this question. Again, your team focused strongly on the economic part of the dimension. I think there, the data and the picture is somewhat clear. But then that doesn't really go hand in hand, right? And I think Asia's economic rise sometimes belies or hides the political fragmentation that the region has. So the question is, how can a region influence or even shape or leads to a new world order if it cannot even, and I think again that seems pretty obvious to me, if it cannot even establish an Asian order?
Yeah, well, picking up on Julia's response to your last question, I mean, our contention on this side of the table is that Asia is not necessarily leading the New World Order, and indeed it could be a version of chaos. Like that's a very, like you could use a different word like fragmentation, which is what many analysts do use to anticipate where we're heading. We're not arguing Asia is going to lead the New World Order. It's that Asia's rise is leading to a New World Order. And the key point here is, again, how do we understand the current world order as it exists? And our argument, at least my half of our argument, is that it's really, from a security perspective, from a geopolitical and diplomatic perspective, it's American power, it's American hegemony since the end of the Cold War that has defined sort of the order that we live in. And we're watching, I mean, you can look around the world, which is kind of feels pretty chaotic to me right now. If we look at the major conflicts in Europe, in the Middle East, where is U.S. leadership? If you contrast it with the real pure unipolar moment in the 1990s, it was the United States that hosted the Dayton Accords, right, that brought an end to a war in Europe, in Yugoslavia. It was the United States that backed the Oslo Accords and then hosted the Camp David summit. The United States was out in front diplomatically. Now, not that it fixed all those problems, but it was American leadership. And we can see now in the ongoing Russian invasion and occupation of Ukraine, in the worsening situation in Israel and Gaza, that vacuum of U.S. leadership. So our contention is that's just going to get worse and worse. Abigail made the sort of economic side of the argument that Asia is moving in terms of the economic growth, but the security side of the argument is simply that U.S. hegemony is sort of falling apart before our eyes.
Thank you. So I think that's a good distinction, right? And what you're saying is that, and you're absolutely right, the motion does not claim that the New World Order will be led by Asia. In fact, there's probably even some wiggle room as to how much order there is in the New World Order. We can talk about that at a later point. So, John, the other John, if we pick up John Delury's point on sort of the vacuum that is increasingly being left by the US receding from its hegemonic position, even if we don't see another country replacing the US tit for tat, and that, again, that seems like a reasonable conclusion, wouldn't already that vacuum mean that a new order is emerging? How can the vacuum be the status quo?
Well, firstly, I think we need to question that whole premise, because when I say that developing countries today want reform of the existing system, they wanted that all through the period of US hegemony. I mean, that's why we called it the Third World, because it wasn't just a US-led bloc and a non-US bloc. It was a whole bunch of countries in between, which for decades, actually, well before the obvious erosion of US hard power, which John's alluded to, were dissatisfied in many ways with the existing system, but not to the point of wanting to overthrow it. I mean, I'm not aware of any country, China included, which wants to go back to a pre-Westphalian world, where international power relations are structured in a fundamentally different way, because when we talk about order, I think it needs to be at a basic level. And as your ad for this event elaborated on the motion, will Asia's development lead to a completely new way of structuring international relations? What I think we see instead, as I said, is a rebalancing where countries around the world which have wanted a different distribution of the benefits of international trade, etc., for a long time are simply more able to pursue that and have accumulated some means to do so. And that's what looks to us like the rise of a new order. But actually, it is still a very interdependent system where, as I pointed out, the very economic statistics which are cited by the other team are a result of trade which fundamentally involves Europe, the United States, other countries, relies on technologies from the advanced economies, and that is not going to change. It may, again, the balance may shift, but the fundamental interdependence of the system will persist.
Thank you. Let me follow up briefly on something, because you've made the point in an earlier statement already, and you kind of came back to this, that this distinction between reform and revolution that Julia earlier made actually does matter, and I agree. And I think now we've heard many terms, from vacuum to fragmentation to rebalancing, and I think it's worth asking, at which point, which criteria for you would have to be fulfilled so that you would be satisfied that we've gone beyond the rebalancing? So which criteria would have to be satisfied to say, well, actually now I agree it's a new world order that you're not seeing yet and don't see on the horizon?
Let's take the other team's premise, right? China is at the center of this. I think that to genuinely see the rise of a new order, you would not only have to see a China that credibly could build this itself without reliance on export markets and other countries, on technologies from the advanced economies, but which also wanted to institute a completely different normative set in place again of the international body of law which has been inherited. I mean, the really big change in order, I would suggest, was what happened in the 19th century, when the Industrial Revolution and the rise of modern technologies enabled the European countries and their offshoots in the New World to effectively really restructure, again, to use your words, Nico, the international order. Now, the reverse of that is not going to happen, I would suggest. You are not going to see it flip to the point where now Western countries depend on China for all of the critical technology. I mean, it's not that simple, of course. China is not dependent on the US for all the critical tech, but certainly you will not see a flip where the asymmetry is now on the other foot. And the same goes for norms, where to the extent that you see other countries voting in the same pattern as China in the UN, articulating the same norms, whether it's for, data sovereignty or whatever example you choose, that is all done within the existing framework. I mean, even in the South China Sea, the Chinese talk about their position as being consistent with international law, even though most other countries, I would suggest, don't see it that way. They don't claim that they have a right to do what they want in the South China Sea because the whole body of international law is a European imposition, and that really what the rule framework that governs this should be is the heavenly authority of the Chinese emperor. I mean, that world is gone forever. And what you see is the Chinese working within the existing frameworks, and this goes for the technical standardization bodies, whatever example you choose, saying that this is the system we will work within. We will simply make it fairer. And you have aligned preferences with other countries which are not necessarily following a Chinese, normative lead. They simply happen to agree that the existing balance of power, if you like, is not fair. And again, you can see that being articulated in relation to, for example, why a different attitude is taken by certain Western governments towards the laws of war and how they're applied in Gaza as opposed to Ukraine, just to use a very pointed example of that.
Thank you. John Lee makes a very good point, and I think we've been kind of skirting around these questions, but I want to address them head on. Obviously, China is a huge factor, even though we're talking about all of Asia, but China, if there's not going to be any new world order driven by Asia's rise, China will be at the front of this. So team arguing in favor, if China had its way, what kind of world order would it pick?
I think the Chinese leadership is pretty clear. And let me quote Xi Jinping at the doorstep of the Kremlin a year ago, saying to Putin, the wind has shifted and it is now our time. And it is time for China to basically shape the global world order in a way where China is going to be at the center. And this is why China has two strategies when it comes to reshaping the new world order. One is to integrate UN international bodies and inject a degree of ideology, and this is why we talk about the Belt and Road Initiative washing of, for instance, UNDP. And this is the gentle way to push people at the top of the UN agencies, to integrate ideology into UN resolutions, and to work within the existing body to reshape them, to ensure that China's is going to be reshaping the norm that it sees does not fit its rise and does not respond to where it stands today. And then you have a second strategy, which is called building alternative structures. And here we have a series. You have all heard about BRICS enlargement, but we can talk about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as a security architecture, which is an alternative for Asia. And you have a number of organizations that are being set up to respond to security, to respond to the question of finance, and this is the AIIB, and the efforts of internationalization of the renminbi. So I think China has a very clear and very well-defined strategy to ensure that the new world order that is emerging is going to respond to one need, which is to ensure that China's rise works in the global system. And with that, it does mean that geopolitical competition with the US is just going to get worse. And this is going to lead to further fragmentation. And while I have a point with Julia, which is chaos versus stability. If you ask the Chinese, there is no doubt that stability is going to prevail, but stability with China at the center.
Thank you very much. And just to be sure I understand, because I think you're making a very clever argument there, is that what you're saying is that part of what China does, which is influencing the current system within the framework, and this may look to the team arguing against like reform, but it's actually not. They're trying to not reform the system, they're trying to change it fundamentally from within.
Can I just add to
Please.
that? I think a fundamental difference between our two approaches is we didn't lead with this argument about what China wants. It's interesting to discuss, but our analysis is more about what is actually happening out there in the world, as opposed to what do various people want. So China has a vision as described by Abigail, but we don't think it's actually going to be able to materialize that vision, because certainly the United States, while I've described its relative power weakening, is not going to accept these conditions. It's not going to accept if China says, look, we'll run things exactly as you did. We'll keep the UN exactly as it is. We'll keep all the international financial institutions exactly as they are. Just let us now have the majority share. Just let us decide. Is that okay? Of course the United States would not accept that, right? So the United States alone, and indeed most of Asia, is not comfortable with Chinese hegemony. So the difference is, what do various countries want versus what is actually happening, whether it's the Chinese case of their vision of replacing U.S. hegemony with their own, or many countries in the world, including in Asia, who would prefer to just kind of reform the system as it is, who would prefer not to have to choose, not to have to face this very rocky period of confrontation between the U.S. and China, would not have to face chaos and fragmentation in the world order. Just because they don't want that to happen doesn't mean it's not going to happen.
Thank you. I want to briefly turn our attention also to India. We've talked a lot about China. That's clearly the key factor here. But you've brought in India, which is part also of the research that your foundation has done. A few months ago, I spoke to somebody about the question whether India is a revisionist power. And I think right now, probably we would all agree, India is not a revisionist power. It doesn't necessarily want to fundamentally reform the way the world works, because also a lot of these things are working out in India's favor right now. But it clearly is a dissatisfied power. It feels that it does not have the level of influence globally that befits its current status as the largest country on the planet, as a fast-rising economy, as sort of this country that can have good relationships with anyone. And I think this is a feeling that you get quickly when you speak to Indian analysts. Now, my question is, they're not going to be a dissatisfied country forever. they're either going to be satisfied or they're going to become revisionist and want to sort of introduce a new world order. So how can we think about of Indian dissatisfaction, and what would we have to do to keep India involved in the status quo?
So I wouldn't disagree that India is dissatisfied. I mean, it's really another rising power in Asia. I wouldn't, excuse me, neglect it. But the thing is that, and when you go to Asia, actually, just to add that, you feel that the spirit, that it's really a country where people feel that something is going to change, that they're on the rise, so they've really incorporated that feeling. So I don't disagree with your point. I just think that what they are currently doing is not something that is opposing, again, what we're seeing. They're not outside of this order, and they don't want to be outside of the current order. Asia is doing a pretty, India, excuse me, is doing a pretty good job in balancing all different actors that are relevant in our current order. They are part of the BRICS. They are also part of the Quad. Their relationship with the US is improving. In our survey, actually, to quote that again, they had a pretty hard time to decide, or they didn't have a pretty hard time to decide, in contrast to South Africa and Brazil, with which country they would side in a moment of US-China rivalry. So they're pretty much sure that they would rather lean with the US than with China. So I wouldn't use them as an example of a power, and that's what I kind of understood from your question, that might mix it all up and create chaos, or be a factor that we, maybe a blind spot that we don't see and that we should take into consideration. So I think they as well, and I think John described that in his previous remarks perfectly, they are as well part of that, what we are currently seeing, that not a blind spot that will mix up everything and create chaos or change.
I'm going to quickly follow up with a question from the audience. So one thing India is dissatisfied about, it's that it's not represented on the UN Security Council. Again, it believes, I would say, would argue with some right that as the world's largest country, it would have a right to be represented there. Will it ever get added to the Security Council? And if not, wouldn't that mean that it can't actually live with the current system for the long time?
I mean, the Security Council reform is complicated, but there is actually some ideas to make this change happen. You can actually get to a review process of the UN Charter with a 2/3 majority in the United Nations General Assembly. You just need one of the 9 members of the United Nations Security Council to vote for it to make that happen. So I think it's not like the impossible thing that everyone always talks about. And I think there is some possibility. It's not completely impossible. Of course, it's a process that is dragging on for a very long time. But I don't think that this would, again, make India become a power that would really lead this revolution that I was talking about before. They're also interested, and the G20 declaration shows it in many ways, they're interested in maintaining the current system.
Thank you. We're slowly getting to the end of the Q&A session, but I do want to address, again, a question that came in from the audience that I think is interesting. So one part of the motion that I think none of you have fundamentally disputed is Asia's rise. You have said it's not just Asia's rise, but I think we've all kind of up here agreed that however we define rising, that Asia is indeed doing that. And of course, a lot of this is defined economically. But then if you look a little bit more closely, is Asia's economy, or the Asian economies actually rising that much? We're seeing China struggle. The Japanese economy is not, growth engine per se. The Indian economy has been an eternal disappointment. So, team arguing in favor of the motion, would we not want to expect to see actually a decline in economic growth in Asia, and wouldn't that sort of negatively impact the outlook on a new world order as driven by Asia?
Yeah, and I'm going to revert back the question, how is the state of our economy? So I think we are all facing a pretty difficult moment in economic terms. Having said that, I think the Asian economies are actually much better placed than ourselves. They're building self-sufficient and resilient mechanisms. And if you take the case of China, there was very recently the two sessions of the parliament, and if you look at the work report and what the Prime Minister is saying is that China is going to invest in technology and science through different means to address the question of economic slowdown. So it may not be the response that we are expecting, because in our terms we think more in terms of, okay, let's have a stimulus package to make the demand goes back. But for the Chinese, they basically make the assessment that by investing in science and technology, they will not care about having the US and the European cutting them from foundational technologies, and this is going to ensure their resilience, and this is going to ensure the fact that their economy is not going to be affected when they are going to take the heat further down the line from us. Having said that, I'm going to come back to part of the argument, which was Asia's rise, yes, is based on an economic model and on an economic growth that is not comparable. It's based on a consumer market that is not comparable. And in reality, this translates into political terms. And recently, there was the Belt and Road Initiative Forum, and I'm pretty sure you have seen the pictures of Xi Jinping walking into the Great Hall with the word behind him. And this must mean something. This must mean that we may disagree here about the attractiveness of the Chinese model, but there are many countries that do agree. And in the survey that Julia worked on emerging powers, actually, while India had a pretty critical view on China, actually Brazil had a very positive view on China. So you have also emerging powers, and you have also a part of the global south that do find the Chinese model attractive.
Thank you. John Lee, the final question is for you. You argued before in your statement that, I think you called it a flip, is impossible, unthinkable. We're not going to see a situation that we had, the position that we had from the US, China take over, that's the current model of interlinkage in trade and technology is so strong that this would basically prohibit any sort of emergence of a hegemonic power as we've seen in the past. And I have to admit, and I don't want to preclude anybody's vote here, but I have a lot of sympathy for this argument. It rings true to me. But then I also feel, historically, we've just been really, really bad at foreseeing these kind of fundamental changes. And we've always assumed, that the current system will inevitably go on forever because it's so stable and that change is just kind of unthinkable. But historically, that's just not been true. So what makes you so sure that it's not going to be this way this time around?
Two levels. Firstly, first principles. As I said, I would submit that we have seen one really big restructuring of the world order, in fact, in the whole course of human history, and that was basically the Industrial Revolution and the way that that revolutionized the relations of production, to use a good Marxist term. So some of you may have seen those charts by Angus Maddison, which show that, over the past 2,000 years or whatever, 80% of world GDP was China and India, up until the early 1800s. What happened? The Industrial Revolution and the technological forces it unleashed flipped that. And that flip is not going to reoccur, at least in the foreseeable future, I would argue. Whatever efficiencies the China model can squeeze out are not the same as first applying steam power and then electricity and all of the other things that have happened subsequently to produce the international distribution of power we see today. Yes, people talk about AI as the new electricity. I personally think that's wrong, but I don't think it's hard to see how moving from several thousand years of peasants tilling the land as 99% of the global population to the world we have today is a fundamental break, and that is not being flipped by Asia's rise. The second level is that even if we focus on the short term and the economic indicators that the other side again has adduced many times, let's look at some of them. So for example, the Brookings survey, a very respectable think tank, but when we talk about Indonesia, for example, being the third or fourth largest economy in the world, so replacing Germany, just to put this in perspective, within the decade, I would argue that is probably based on a straight line projection, which puts a lot more weight on the population of the country, which of course in the pre-industrial world was very important, but which could be destabilized by all kinds of things, like large parts of Indonesia going under the ocean from climate change in the next couple of decades, including the capital city. There are many uncertainties, as you pointed out yourself, Nico, as to the rise of the Asian countries, even within the foreseeable future, which I don't think are disputable, that at least they present risk factors. I mean, I won't talk more about China. People will have read about the overcapacity issues, the economic slowdown, the question about whether the re-centralization undersea is going to kill, the dynamism that has got China where it is over the past quarter century. But just to close in with one more example, again from the opposite side. Yes, it may be the case that a third of the world's industrial robots have been installed in China over the last few years. Where are they made, or who owns the core technology? And even where the underlying tech has been produced by Chinese companies, which European companies, I can say from personal knowledge, entirely public space, I should add, were involved in co-developing that. It is still the case that the advanced economies, so let's say the Western side of the ledger, to oversimplify, or the US side, hold a lot of cards in this interdependent world. And I would personally want to see a lot more evidence of that fundamentally changing. These very deep-seated structural factors before we can talk about Asia's rise, which is, of course, very impressive, restructuring the international system and giving rise to a new world order.
Thank you very much. And that concludes the discussion and Q&A part of the debate, and it's now time for closing remarks, which will be delivered in the same order than the opening remarks and rebuttals, which mean that the first closing remarks are for Abigaël Vasselier, arguing in favor of today's motion that Asia's rise will lead to a new world order. Abigaël, you have 2 minutes.
Thanks. I think we have all agreed by now that there is no doubt about Asia's rise. The question is, what is going to be this new world order looking like? And I think John explained that we are not here to think about how much chaos this can bring, how much fragmentation this is going to bring. And I have a very gloomy picture. For me, we have failed to reform the UN system for decades now, and this is not going to change. I think further fragmentation is simply going to mean that our international institutions are failing. Having said that, we are here to debate whether Asia's rise will lead to a new world order. And I think you have a case about the demographics. I think I've made a case about the economic and financial driver that are going to reshape the new world order. And I think I've made a case about how much appealing the Asian model can be and the China model. And we may disagree, but let's face it, actually, most of the Global South do agree that there is a case about the Chinese economic development model. So yes, we as Europeans may have to adapt and adjust to these new realities. Whether we like them or not, that's not what we are debating today. But for what we have to acknowledge is that the challenges and opportunities that Asia's rise is going to present will bring us together to this new world.
Thank you very much. And we're moving it right along for closing statements from the team arguing against the motion. Julia Ganter, 2 minutes for you as well.
Thank you. So I made a couple of examples in the beginning where we shouldn't be too Asia-centric, and my colleagues even have been very China-centric, I have to say, and I want to stick to that point because there's really a couple of countries on the rise too outside of Asia, and we would really miss big time if we just ignored that they are on the rise, that they have a say, that they are going to assume leadership roles as well, and that with all of that, with their increasing self-confidence in so many countries, I've given you the numbers in the beginning, that this will also have an impact on the kind of world order that we will see and the changes. But as I've said, reform's not revolution, and I'm going to stick to that point, and I don't want to be so pessimistic about the options that we have for reform. I don't want to make a point that we will see a United Nations Security Council reform happening soon, of course, I mean, but there's so many other initiatives. There's a Bridgetown initiative on climate financing. Leaders met last year in Paris. President Macron invited them to discuss the financial international architecture. They came up with an agreement. So there's things happening, and we have to consider also that these countries really have a new self-confidence. It's not the same debate that we are having at the moment than a couple of years ago, because these countries have changed as well. So there is also the Pact for the Future in the UN. So there's several things happening, and we really have to consider that and not be too pessimistic about reform. And I want to make one last point, because this was said by the other group a couple of times. The China model is really not attractive. So it's, even if they are if they see China as an opportunity, they send their kids to universities in other countries, not to China, because it's not a model that is attractive for them. And I think this is a really relevant point that we must consider. They won't follow the Chinese model. They have their own opinions, and they will vocalize them loudly. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Julia Ganter. Closing remarks from the team arguing in favor of the motion. John Delury, 2 minutes for you as well.
Okay, thanks, Nico. I mean, just as an aside, I'm an American, but I hope my kids don't go to school in the United States. And in fact, now they're not. So, I think the other side had a very tough job ahead of them. And so in order to, get you to be skeptical about the proposition, they had to sort of fall back on other arguments. And no one seemed to dispute that Asia is rising. We don't dispute other parts of the world are rising, that Africa and other parts of the world are rising, and those are very important developments. But again, that wasn't really the question that we were brought here to debate. I worried that I was going to be doing too much history when I went back to 1945. Little did I know they'd go back to Westphalia and the Industrial Revolution. But there's a serious point there, which is I think they had to define the world order in those terms of a matter of centuries, because if we take the meaning of world order, if you agree more with our, I think, more common sense definition of world order as the world that we've lived in, the geopolitics, also the economic interdependence, the globalization, that was the case since the end of the Cold War, our contention is we are watching that unravel. I mean, here's the short list. The global financial crisis, the Eurozone crisis, Brexit, we didn't even talk about. Trump, we didn't even talk about. Trump may be coming back, we didn't talk about. COVID, Ukraine, Gaza, and that list is not done. There will be more to that list, right? And again, our contention is what was holding back a lot of those forces was U.S. predominance. The U.S. was peerless. The United States, by its own admission, if you read the last national security statement, says we now have peer competitors, Russia and China. So economically and in security terms, we're watching it fall apart. A new order, even if it's chaos, will emerge.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, the closing statement from John Lee arguing against today's motion.
So, firstly, there must be a high bar for a new order. The other side have tried to convince us heroically that it can be about a redistribution of power, for which I think there is no argument, or about a shift in the distribution of trade. I would submit, if we talk about order, it must be about structuring principles, the way that academics often discuss international order. And that, at the very least, we would have to see, to argue for the rise of a new order, some evidence that, let's say, developing countries en masse are following Chinese leadership. Even if we cannot see the outlines, there has to be the spirit there, or the tendency. And what I see, what our team has argued, that this is, again, about very well-established interests and preferences which are being pursued in ways which are much more confrontational for we who live, fortunately, in the rich countries than we have been confronted with in the past. The other reason that I'm optimistic that the existing order will last is that there is no time for a fundamental new order to develop. If we did not face a climate crisis, which is going to affect all countries drastically, within the next 1 or 2 decades. If we had longer, then we could talk about the potential space for a new international order to develop. But the reality is that today, however hawkish they are on China, US and European politicians still always caveat by saying, and yet we need to work with them on climate change. And from the developing countries, and I've already talked about many of these states literally facing being underwater. I mean, we even talk about India, Bangladesh, big developing countries for whom this is an existential threat that leaves no time or headspace to worry about fundamental new orders.
Thank you very much, John Lee, and that concludes the arguments heard in today's Oxford debate, which means it's now time for the most important event of all, which are your second votes. You know by now how this works. You scan, please, the Slido code that you see, or you just go back to Slido. The same poll than you have seen before. Asia's rise will lead to a new world order. Do you agree or disagree with this motion? And now, I'm told enough stalling. The results are ready, which I have not seen, and we're just going to throw up on the screen for all of us to see at the same time, please. Okay, so before the debate, 71% agreed with the motion and only 22% disagreed with the motion. This has changed to after the debate to 45% agreeing and 44% disagreeing, which is a minus of 26% in favor and a plus of 22% against the motion, which means the team arguing against the motion, Julia Ganter and John Lee, has won. A huge congratulations and applause for you. But of course, also congratulations and thank you to John Delury and Abigaël Vasselier. It's always harder to argue the majority position, and you did so wonderfully. I should note, which is unusual, that there's been an increase in people who are not sure, which I think just goes back to my point before, that we have more questions than answers. This really doesn't happen very often. Thank you all very, very much for being here tonight. It's been a pleasure debating with you. A big round of applause for our speakers, please.